We will take a look at the definition of the term figure of speech. Then we will examine 6 different figures of speech. And then finally, we will look at an exercise in which we identify the figures of speech expressed in sentences. We begin by discussing the meaning of the term figure of speech. Now, a figure of speech is a way of saying a message. I like to look at it as a creative way of saying a message. So, figures of speech, what they do for your writing is that they make it more creative, more colorful, more engaging, more vivid. So, for example, instead of saying, my tall, slim uncle walked into the room, we can use a figure of speech that says, my uncle, the lamppost, walked into the room. And by using the latter sentence, by using that particular figure of speech, the metaphor, the effect, of course, it is more striking. It is more vivid. So the image that you want to create in the reader's mind, you're able to do that more effectively by using that particular figure of speech. So the first thing to understand is that a figure of speech is a creative way of conveying a particular meaning. Many figures of speech, however, they are not statements which should be taken literally, as they are not factual statements. So I'm going back to the example that I used a while ago. My uncle, the lamppost, walked into the room. Now, like I did mention a while ago, that's an example of a metaphor. Now, literally, you do not mean that your uncle is a lamppost. It is not a factual statement to say that he is a lamppost. However, what is happening here is that I have compared him to a lamppost in order to convey the meaning or the idea that he is tall and he is slim. So that reinforces the idea that when we talk about a figure of speech, it is not a literal factual statement. Instead, it is seen as a creative way of conveying a particular meaning. The first figure of speech that we will look at is the simile. Now, the simile, in terms of its function, compares two unlike things, or it compares two things that are different. But even though these two things are different, they have something in common. They have something alike. Now, in order to make this comparison, we use the words as or like. Let's look at example number 1. His head looks like an egg decorated with eyes, nose, and a mouth. So in this example, there is a comparison being made between two different things, two things that are unlike. But even though these two things are different, they have something in common. So the two things which are being compared here are his head and an egg. And what they have in common is the shape. So perhaps his head is shaped like an oval, similar to an egg. And notice that the comparison is made using the word like. Example number 2 reads, the curls in Anna's hair looked like oversized noodles. Again, there's a comparison here between two different things, two unlike things, the curls in Anna's hair and the oversized noodles. So even though these two things are different, they have something in common. And this comparison is made again using the word like. When we think about the simile, think comparison. That is the function of the simile, to make a comparison between two different things, two unlike things. And this comparison is made using the words as or like. The metaphor is similar in function to the simile. So, like the simile, the metaphor, it also makes a comparison between two different things or two things that are unlike and not the same. But even though these two things are different, they have something in common. Now, unlike your simile, the metaphor does not rely on the words as or like in order to make the comparison. Example 1. Without the wind, the grove of trees became an army of soldiers standing at attention. In this example, there is a comparison. The comparison is being made between the grove of trees and soldiers, an army of soldiers standing at attention. When you think of an army of soldiers standing at attention, they're standing still, they're erect in their posture. So the grove of trees, without the wind blowing through them, they are basically standing still. So that is the meaning that the comparison is trying to convey. And notice that this comparison does not rely on the words as and like. So this comparison does not depend on the word as or like in order to facilitate the comparison. Number 2, the sun set the earth ablaze. Now, there are some examples of metaphors, many to be exact, where the comparison is not direct. Rather, the comparison is implied. So you have to be able to read between the lines now in order to figure out what two things are being compared. Example 2, the sun set the earth ablaze. Now, in this sentence, the comparison is being made between the heat of the sun and fire. Now, the sentence could have said, the sun was fire. In that case, the comparison would have been more direct, it would have been more obvious. However, the comparison here is implied since the word ablaze, that has to do with when something is on fire. So it is understood, it is implied here that the comparison is between the heat of the sun and fire. Now this table here demonstrates the differences or the difference between the simile and the metaphor. Both make comparisons, but while the simile depends on the word as or like, the metaphor does not. So the simile says, her head is round like a ball. The metaphor, however, says, her head is a ball. In both of these examples, her head is being compared to a ball, but the simile uses like, the metaphor does not. Number 2, he is as tall as a lamppost. That's the simile. The metaphor says he is a lamppost. So if we look at the metaphor, he is a lamppost, we can see that there's a comparison there. He is being compared to a lamppost. However, this comparison is not made with the use of the word as or like. The simile, however, relies on as in order to make the comparison. Number 3, the simile says, her cheeks are as red as cherries. The metaphor says, her cheeks are cherries. So what you need to understand is that the simile and the metaphor, they are similar in terms of function in that they both make comparisons between two unlike things, two things that are different. Your simile depends on the words as and like to make the comparison. The metaphor does not. In some cases, the comparison is not stated directly in the metaphor. The comparison is sometimes implied. Personification. Now, personification is a figure of speech in which a human quality or action is given to an inanimate object. The word inanimate has to do with not having human qualities. In essence, a personification allows a non human thing to behave like a person. Example 1 says, the leaves waved to the passers by. Now, in this example, you are causing the leaves to behave like a person. You are giving the leaves the human action of waving. Hence, we say that the leaves are being personified. Being personified because you are giving a non human thing a human action to be able to wave in this case. Example 2. My alarm clock screamed in my ear. In this case, you are allowing the alarm clock to behave like a person. You are giving the alarm clock the human action of screaming. Hence, we can say that the alarm clock is being personified, being made to behave like a person. Your onomatopoeia. When you hear the word onomatopoeia, think sound, sound words. Because an onomatopoeia is a word that is used to represent a particular sound that is associated with certain actions or certain objects. So the crash and the bang and the buzz, all these are examples of onomatopoeic words. Like I said, whenever you think onomatopoeia, you think sound words. Example 1, the snake slithered and hissed. Hissed is the example of onomatopoeia because this is the word that we use, or the word hiss we associate it with the sound that a snake makes. The clanging pots and pans woke the baby. Clanging, that's the sound word there. That's the onomatopoeic word there. So that loud metallic sound that we associate with pots and pans, when they knock against each other. That is the sound word there. So like I said, your onomatopoeia, you always think sound. The particular sound that we use to represent the sound that certain actions or objects make. Alliteration, these are your tongue twisters. An alliteration is the repetition of an initial, and that word initial, it means beginning. So the repetition of an initial consonant sound in a series of words. Notice I did not say a beginning letter sound because alliteration has to do only with consonant sounds. If we talk about vowel sounds, that's a different figure of speech altogether. Example, Cassano and Carol care about Cassie. This is an example of alliteration because you have the repetition of that hard C sound coming at the beginning of these four words. K, Cassano, Carol, K, Cassie. Similarly, number 2, let's leave the lazy lads alone. Alliteration, because again, you have the repetition of that beginning L sound in this series of words, the let's and the leave and lazy lads. Okay, so alliteration, the repetition of a consonant sound coming at the beginning of a series of words. And we move on now to Mr. Hyperbole. Now, Mr. Hyperbole is the one who exaggerates. It is, in fact, an exaggeration that is used to emphasize a particular point. And we use hyperboles every day in our speech. Example 1, the loud music in the minibus deafened the passengers. Now, literally, the passengers, they have not been deafened by the loud music. However, this is an example where you exaggerate in order to emphasize that the music was very loud. Number 2, Mrs. Jonas's students take a lifetime to write a 300-word essay. Again, literally, They do not take a lifetime to write a 300-word essay. However, what the sentence does is that it exaggerates in order to emphasize that they take a very long time to write a 300-word essay. Hence, hyperbole. Now that we have looked at these different figures of speech, it is time to practice. So in this exercise, you are to identify the figure of speech expressed in each of the following sentences. We have looked at the simile. The simile compares two unlike things with the use of as or like. Your metaphor, similarly, compares two unlike things without the use of as or like. Your onomatopoeia, think sound words. Your personification, allowing a non-human thing to behave like a person. Your hyperbole, this is where you exaggerate to emphasize something. And then your alliteration, the tongue twisters, where you have the initial or the beginning consonant sound in a series of words being repeated. Number 1 reads, borrow the blue book on the bed. Now, this is an example of, yep, you guessed it, alliteration. And why? Because you have the repetition of that sound B from letter B coming at the beginning of the words borrow, blue, book, and bed. Number 2, the wall was a solid block of sandpaper against her back. What might this be? There is a comparison here. The comparison is between the wall and sandpaper without the use of as or like. The meaning that is conveyed here is in the same way that sandpaper, it's grainy and it's rough. That's how the wall was against her back. So a comparison between these two different things without as or without like. And you guessed it, that's a metaphor. Good. Number 3, I have told you 1,000,000 times that a tomato is a fruit. Now, what is this? You will agree with me that there is here an exaggeration to emphasize that I have told you this so many times over and over. So the figure of speech that exaggerates to emphasize a particular point is the hyperbole. Number 4, the solar eclipse looked like a giant ring of fire. There is a comparison here between the solar eclipse and a giant ring of fire. So two things are being compared here. And this comparison is made using the word like. So what figure of speech functions to express a comparison and which depends on the word like to make that comparison? And the answer is the simile. Very good. So we're halfway through the exercise. Let's move on to our final 4 items. Your instructions are the same. Number 5 says, the squeaking led us to discover the mouse in the kitchen. So you ask yourself, what are we seeing in this sentence? You should be paying attention to the word squeaking, that high-pitched sound that we hear from mice, for example. So we have here a sound word. So the word squeaking is the word that we use to associate with the sound that a mouse makes. Hence, onomatopoeia. Like I said before, whenever you think sound words, you think onomatopoeia. Number 6 reads, from a distance, the calm sea water looks like an enormous blue blanket. There is another comparison here. So the calm water is being compared to an enormous blue blanket. To make this comparison, we use the word like in this case. Now, what figure of speech functions to make a comparison between two different things using the word like? The answer, simile. Number 7. The water in the lake was a mirror that reflected my sad face. There is another comparison here. So, the water in the lake is being compared to a mirror. Two different things, but they have something in common. That is the ability to reflect. Now, this comparison is not made using as or like. So think about the figure of speech whose function is to make a comparison, yes, but which does not depend on as or like. That's right, the metaphor. And then finally, number 8, the wind embraced me with its icy arms. Now, in this case, we're making the wind behave like a person, giving the wind the ability to embrace. Now, what figure of speech allows a non human thing to behave like a person? Personification. You're giving the wind the human action of embracing. Well done. So, we have come to the end of another lesson. We have looked at 6 different figures of speech, your simile and metaphor, which function to compare two different things. Your simile depends on as or like, your metaphor does not. Your onomatopoeia, when we think about onomatopoeia, we think about sound. Personification, allowing a non-human thing to behave like a person, giving that non-human thing human actions and qualities. The hyperbole, an exaggeration in order to emphasize a point. And then your alliteration, the tongue twisters, like I said earlier, where you have a consonant sound being repeated at the beginning of a series of words. So like this video and subscribe to our channel, Excel with L. Until then, keep excelling.